Good morning, everyone. I'm Debbie Sease. I'm the National Campaign Director for the Sierra Club, and I want to welcome you all here this morning. And those of you who've joined us electronically, thank you so much for coming. As we gather here today across town, already the trade agreement that we're here to talk about is under the early stages of negotiation. This is an issue that draws together a very wide array of allies, because unlike many other trade compacts, the US-EU agreement is not looking at the traditional tariffs and other trade issues. It's actually going right at the safeguards, standards, regulations that protect our food, our water, our families from chemicals that in our products. It's touching everyone. So today we are focusing mostly on environment, farm food issues, a little bit on labor and consumer safety, but there's a whole host of parts of our life that this compact will affect. And so hopefully this is the first of many educational forums. I thank you all for joining us today, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ginny, I wrote your name down, Ginny Robb Ned, to introduce our first panel. So again, thanks for coming, and enjoy and learn a lot and get ready to get active.
Hello. My name is Ginny Robb Ned. I work with the Center for Effective Government, and I serve as the coordinator for the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. CSS is a broad coalition of 150 organizations spanning all consumer issues, including environmental, labor, and good government groups, and we're united in promoting and, well, defending and promoting a strong system of regulatory safeguards, provides the framework for strong quality of life for Americans and a stable economy. Today I am going to outline quickly 5 matters of concern for our regulatory system of this trade agreement, and then introduce our first panel who will tell us more about what is at stake. First matter of concern, number 1. Democratically elected federal, state, and local officials have the responsibility to and must continue to have the authority to protect their citizens from emerging threats and safety hazards. TAFTA's stated aim is to negotiate away non-tariff trade barriers or behind the border obstacles. That is really code for just sweeping deregulation and new lowest cost requirements that would prevent EU and US governments from developing the safety standards that their children and families need. Second, transparency. Transparency is key, as trade agreements that threaten to dramatically reduce health and safety standards must be negotiated in public, and citizens and public interest groups must have the ability to participate in those negotiations. So for a long time, corporations have had access to high-level negotiators and to their materials. With corporate interests involved and negotiators involved, really the only ones being left out are the public. Those negotiating texts should be made available to the public as soon as they are tabled. The third thing is that we are united in our position against regulatory ceilings. Regulatory ceilings hurt us economically by failing to embrace pragmatic improvement and innovation. So if across the board standards are adopted, first of all, they should be rising to the highest level of protection, not stooping to the lowest common denominator. But also we should ensure that local governments continue to have the authority to develop the sensible, well-suited safeguards that we need for the future. And that approach will actually help us economically. It'll make sure firms are competing on the right things. It'll help the emerging industries of the future embrace clean manufacturing, safer chemicals, and clean energy solutions of the future. The fourth thing, we know that investor-state dispute resolution in TAFTA is a Trojan horse for deregulation, and it will cost already strapped governments enormous amounts of money in legal fees. So you'll hear more about this today, as I think with all of these issues I've been talking about, but ISDR is a mechanism that sets up an alternative to a nation's regular court system. This mechanism has been used under previous trade agreements like TAFTA and NAFTA to sue governments to force them to deregulate or face a fine. And already over $400 million in public funds have been awarded to investors, and scores of domestic regulations have been disregarded. This undermines national sovereignty, it undermines national standards, and cultural preferences. And then the final thing I'll touch on quickly is that TAFTA will impose additional cost-benefit requirements that are not required by U.S. law. So if you spend any time working with CSS, you know we talk a lot about the flawed system of cost-benefit analysis. Often cost-benefit analysis fails to adequately or accurately predict the benefits for proposed regulations, especially those that are hard to monetize, like quality of life and health. It also often overstates the cost of compliance to industry of those proposed regulations. So it's tilting our whole regulatory decision-making toward corporate interests. We shouldn't be demanding more of this analysis that's not required by law. In fact, many of our favorite statutes specifically prohibit cost-benefit analysis, things like the Clean Air Act, OSHA, and MSHA. If TAFTA, under the guise of removing trade barriers, were to require lowest cost standards and cost-benefit analysis to justify regulation, it would just nullify many of our environmental, worker health, and safety and consumer protections that Congress has voted into law. So those are sort of 5 issues I've outlined. You'll hear more about all of them today, I think, in greater detail and with issue-specific examples. I think our position can be summed up pretty easily. Standards and safeguards. Our regulatory system provides standards and safeguards that are important to Americans' quality of life, and those shouldn't be traded away. There are 3 people here with me today. You only see 2 of them. One will be joining us by audio. Great. And they can tell us much more about the concerns we're dealing with and about what's at stake. So first, Lori Wallach is the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. She's also the co-founder of Citizens Trade Campaign and has promoted the public interest regarding globalization and trade issues in every forum. So Congress, foreign parliaments, the courts, government agencies, and the media. I'll just introduce all 3 of you and then you guys can take it from there. Natasha Cingotti is a corporate and transparency campaigner at Friends of the Earth Europe in Brussels, where she has been part of their economic justice team for the past 4 years. And her campaign areas include the promotion of enhanced lobbying, transparency, and ethics regulation at the EU level, challenging the structural imbalance of EU advisory groups, and advocating for better public access to EU information. And then finally, Celeste Drake is the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist at the AFL-CIO. She's been actively following not only this free trade agreement, but also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as the International Services Agreement, and she covers issues related to the World Trade Organization, economic development, and manufacturing policy. So with that, you each have about 10 minutes. And I will let you take it away. One thing I should note for those that are following along at home, questions from the webcast can be sent to tafta@citizenstrade.org, and we'll probably mention that again throughout the morning. Thanks.
Thank you, Ginny, and I want to thank the Sierra Club in general and Alana Solomon in specific for taking the initiative to organize this. Good morning to everyone here in Washington and good afternoon to everyone in Europe. The job I have is to set the context of the agreement, and I'm going to keep looking over my shoulder at my slide, but I have put into these slides a lot more material than I'll be able to talk about, with the notion that it's going to be an archived webinar and people can go back to it. So this agreement has been dubbed by its proponents TTIP, but in fact it's got a long history. It's an agreement with a history. And it has another name, which is more accurate, which is TAFTA, the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement. So when we heard that there was going to be a US-EU agreement, a lot of us were hopeful. A lot of the European standards, actually, consumer environmental standards are superior, labor standards to the US. So this was the possibility for the actual long-awaited 21st century new upward trade agreement. And it was fairly heartbreaking, therefore, when the high-level US-EU dialogue published its paper in February. And what we saw was an announcement of a launch of an agreement that's a lot like the old-fashioned US free trade agreement, the old NAFTA model, which we've been living with the damaging results of. So it was disappointing, but not totally shocking, because here's the context. Although we heard TAFTA is this new thing that's been launched and it's modern, in fact, it's been a project of a block of US and European corporations that were established in the early 1990s in the form of something called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. It has recently changed its name to Transatlantic Business Council, but it's the same gang of large US and EU companies. That forum was set up for them to have a special dialogue with US cabinet members and European Commission ministers. And for a long time, they've had a very specific agenda. I have on the slide a list of those companies, not necessarily the friends of the environment and consumer and labor rights. So their agenda all along has been to what they call eliminate trade irritants and to facilitate their business practices. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the code word here, because up front, we have heard from the US and European Union that this agreement is not going to be about traditional trade matters. The average tariff between the US and the EU is already very low, around 3%, the border tax on traded goods. So what's this about? It is about behind the border regulatory issues, as Ginny said. And some code words folks need to know. What's behind the border? That is code, that is a nice euphemism for what we would otherwise know as our domestic policies that Congress, state legislators, and regulatory agencies should be making through transparent means in the US, with those of us who will live with the results having input on the outcomes. What is a trade irritant? See also non-tariff barrier, code NTB. This is not a cheer, this is a problem. These are things that we would otherwise in our world know as our highest environmental, food safety, worker safety standards. Some of the ones that we know are targeted because, happily, the companies have been very explicit over the last 20 years listing what they think of as the irritants, aka our strong standards, that they want to eliminate. Some of those things, key parts of the US financial re-regulation, not just Dodd-Frank, but a list of other specific regulations. There are a whole set of complaints against our state-by-state insurance regulation system, where some states like California do very progressive, cool things, and that leads the country. In the European Union, superior food standards, not allowing our foods that are slaughtered in sloppy ways and then dunked in chlorine to kill all of the critters that are remaining in the feces that we tolerate on our chickens, for instance, as well as artificial growth hormones, and European system of segregating and labeling GMO foods. The EU chemical policy reach, you're going to hear more details in each of these issues. Some parts of the EU climate directive have been targeted by US companies, and now NSA, various privacy directives, including the safe harbors policy, which in the European Union means you can't offshore data that's privacy protected unless to a safe harbor, i.e. a place with these kind of protections. And legacy issue, another code word, that would be a trade irritant that has not been axed yet. Next slide. So what exactly are we really talking about? And this really is sort of the punchline of the entire presentation. We don't have time to go through it, but I wanted to put in the information of the issues that aren't covered in this particular seminar, but I'm sure will be covered in other teach-ins on this subject. Because as Ginny said, this is really a vehicle that is broad-ranging and has very little to do with trade. So some of the issues that we're not going to talk about are going to be the ones I'm going to focus on. I've just summarized the first issue, the harmonization of standards. Some of the mechanisms are things like mutual recognition and free passage, where this is the goal of the European Union for financial regulations. If a company meets the financial regulations in Europe, they have to be allowed to operate here. We still would have the liability. We still would suffer the consequences if it wasn't a strong enough standard, but the companies in Europe that met their standards wouldn't have to meet our standards. This is also a goal the U.S. has with a bunch of those food safety rules. So we'd be able to import stuff that did not meet the better European standards if it met our standards. Another big set of issues we don't have time to talk about, but very important, financial rollback, as well as service sector regulation writ large, from all the environmental issues around energy and climate to issues around healthcare and other fundamental essential services. Under this agreement, there are a set of regulatory policies that are simply banned, even if they treat domestic and foreign companies the same. This is the model that we've seen in past U.S. free trade agreements. This is what the high-level declaration says is going to be the model. This is something we need to not have repeated. Similarly, a ban on things like capital controls or financial transaction taxes, the Robnett tax, it's really gained traction, in the EU would be forbidden. Now, a lot of people are thinking, why is this in a trade agreement? Very good question. These are not trade issues. Then the new foreign investor privileges. You're going to hear more about that from Alana, but in sum, these are rules that give foreign corporations extensive new rights and new intellectual property rights, copyright rules that could limit internet freedom and more. Next slide, please. This is what everyone thinks of as a trade agreement. I put this in there just to have everyone think, ah, this is trade. Not anymore. Next slide. That system was replaced, hit it again, by the new modern globalization agreements of the World Trade Organization and the free trade agreements. Next slide, please. All of those other agreements are non-trade traditional matters, limiting service sector regulation, imposing new intellectual property rights, etc. Key take-home. This agreement is not about trade. That's a branding stunt. It's a global system of enforceable governance. Break our hearts, the multilateral environmental agreements, the International Labor Organization standards, not so enforceable. This, in contrast, would be enforceable. The binding provision is countries shall ensure the conformity of their domestic policies to the agreement. That's the boilerplate from the WTO. That kind of language shows up in every US FTA. It is enforced. Governments can sue governments and put trade sanctions in place if you don't gut a law that does not meet those rules, or corporations can directly sue the governments outside our courts through investor state tribunals, the outrageous system that Ginny mentioned. This is not about trade between countries. This is diplomatic legislating by trade officials who see their constituency narrowly as U.S. companies. This is not democracy of decisions with those who will live with the results. So perhaps the most clear revelation of what this agreement, as it's currently construed, again, heartbreak, could be different, is the fact it has the investor state system. Now, we don't have time to go through it. I put it in the slide so that everyone could see the structure of it. The bottom line of it is individual companies get new rights in the agreement, get elevated to the same level as a signatory nation state, individual company equal with entire nation state, to sue governments outside domestic courts to privately enforce a public treaty and new special privileges by demanding cash from us taxpayers to compensate the costs of basic environmental, land use, health, labor, and other policies. Next slide. The tribunals are 3 private sector attorneys. They rotate between being the judges and suing governments. They can demand payment of unlimited sums of cash. There are no conflict of interest rules, and there are no outside appeals. Next slide. The system of these attacks has gone through the ceiling. Everything you can imagine has been attacked, from tobacco controls to mining policy, from water policy to labor rights. Next slide. 15 of these individuals rotating as judges and litigators now have 55% of the cases. This is a disaster. Next slide. Why would this possibly be in a US-EU trade agreement? It was supposed to be for developing countries that did not have functioning courts. I beg the question, is it the US or the EU who has crappy property rights laws and dysfunctional courts? Neither, thus revealing the corporate agenda. I threw in the slide because people say, this is not believable, except this is just a smorgasbord of a few of the cases that have actually had corporations paid out or laws sacked. Next slide. So summing up, who writes the rules? Rules. So we all need to get involved, because right now 600 corporate advisors have direct access. The plan is not to have this negotiation have access for most of us to the actual texts. Congress, if fast-track trade authority is allowed again, perhaps it won't be, would be sidelined. And then we have basically US and EU corporate demands masquerading as a trade agreement being implemented around normal process. Final slide. Why would this be done? I'm just going to leave this for people to ponder as I exit. The claim is that we're going to get great growth and efficiency gains. And in fact, this is something that has never been proved. This is premised on the notion that deregulation creates gain somehow. This is a myth, and in fact, the empirical studies on this kind of convergence of regulations in the EU do not show the efficiency gains and growth that's being promised. And in fact, the two main studies, one that's being worked on, the US one, and the major EU one, which I take down here, have incredible flaws in their design. There's simply no basis for the claim that there are gains, yet we know what the downsides are. So why now? Because the big companies hope Europe is so desperate for any growth that they'll cave in all their superior standards, which would be a ceiling on progress for us in the future and a rollback for them that's simply not tolerable. On the back table, letters from US and EU organizations to the heads of state at the launch of this negotiation, laying out the other vision of what it should be and what's not acceptable. The transatlantic consumer dialogue, all the US and EU consumer groups laying out the agenda, and for the wonks, a copy of our comments to the record. Thank you very much.
Great. So we are now going to attempt to pull in Natasha.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hi, we can hear you. Thanks. Go ahead.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot for your invitation to have a European perspective in this panel. I hope the technology works and you can actually hear all of the presentation. I thought I've been invited to give you a bit of European perspective on this trade deal, so probably we should start by giving you a little overview of the European context. I'm not going to give you a lecture on the situation, but all of you know, of course, that we are experiencing, as Laurie was saying, a massive economic and financial crisis, which is at the moment mainly resulting in strong austerity measures for people. This is translated into an attack to the European social model, and basically the main feeling in Europe at the moment is that citizens are paying the cost of a crisis that was created by a lack of regulation for corporations. So in this context, I have to say that we cannot really say there is massive enthusiasm around the talks of the EU-US trade agreements, especially in the background of the NSA spying revelations that came out last week, basically. What is interesting, and that's also linking up really well to what Laurie was talking about, is that our decision makers in Europe at the moment are promoting this deal as something new to get us out of the multifold crisis we are experiencing, saying that we are going to find new jobs, new growth, new competitiveness in this agreement. Well, actually, if you look at the draft mandate, the language that you can see is very similar to what you had already back 2005, 2006 in the communications of the Department of Trade of the European Commission. So in fact, there is not only a lot of suspicions about the context and the framing of this agreement, but I think for civil society organizations and people in general, it's very hard to believe that there is anything new in this transatlantic deal, and there's really an untapped potential considering that the relationship is already highly integrated. Which brings me to my next slide, which is about the process itself. And as a lack of transparency that we are experiencing, I think we can safely say that the situation in the EU is as bad, if not even worse than in the US, because we don't even have this trade advisory committee, even though yours is really bad, obviously. So civil society has to rely on leaks to see the text. Our European Parliament, which is the only elected body in the EU institutions, itself has a limited access because only members working on trade can see the text with their assistants and administration, and of course they cannot share it. I'm not even talking about the high-level group, which has been preparing the recommendations for the mandate because the European Commission has consistently refused to disclose the membership. Which brings us to the question that, again, Laurie rightfully pointed, of whether this is really a partnership, a new partnership, or if it's just the repetition of an old model of free trade agreements that we have already experienced and we know are essentially flawed. So what we see very much from the elements in the mandate at the moment, from the process itself, is in fact that this is just an attempt to bring new rights to investors and corporations and attack existing regulations. The difference compared to before for Europe is that actually in the context of the crisis, people are waking up to what this could actually mean for their regulations, their lifestyle, their rights, basically. In the past, quite selfishly, when Europe had free trade agreements, it was mainly with developing countries, and we have to admit that this was very often beneficial in your daily life in terms of having access to resources, to food. But this time, what European citizens very much see is that what is in the radar is their regulations. They also see that countries which are also developed, as they are being called, like Australia, Canada, have faced recently really strong challenges to existing regulations because of claims brought by investors under the specific rights granted in free trade agreements. So this resonates a lot, not only in relation to existing regulations, but also because, as I was saying at the beginning, we are experiencing a terrible crisis and public budgets at EU level, at national level, are already doing very bad. So that's the next slide. Now I'm going into the content. Of course, we have a very limited time to discuss this, but it is very clear that with the two biggest trading blocs negotiating a free trade agreement, all regulatory issues are on the table. Of course, as an environment organization, we are especially concerned on the possible implication on food, environment, energy, chemicals assessments. But I think what I'd like to stress is that it's not only the issue of regulatory convergence and bringing standards at the same level, but very much also about this threat of mutual recognition, which civil society here sees as having a very big potential to bring things we don't want, as Laurie was mentioning, for instance, on agricultural goods that would not meet our standards into the back door in Europe. Now, having said that, and I think that's one of my main concern or message as also an environment climate activist, I think this trade agreement negotiations will be critical for two reasons. We have, as I said, these two biggest trading blocks negotiating an agreement. Theoretically, this could mean a really incredible potential to be very ambitious, very visionary. However, the process and the content tell us that one, established rights are being attacked, and if we take the environment example for Europe, that's for instance the precautionary or the polluter pays principles, which are enshrined in our treaties and are really at the basis of any decision we take on environment, on food, etc. Now, the real risk is that as these two trade powers are busy arguing about the content and arguing about who is going to protect which established rights, we miss a little bit the big picture, which is the incredible challenge we have in front of us in a context of crisis, not only economic, financial, but also the climate and environment crisis. Actually, to tackle this, we need to go much higher than the measures that we have, the existing regulations that we have. And for this, actually, we would need the EU and the US to take the lead. But what we see emerging from this process is not something going in this direction. So this brings me to my conclusion, and the last slide is basically what we want to send is really a strong message to our US counterparts that we are ready to work directly with you in the coming months, in the coming years. Our contexts of operations are very different, but I think the challenges are very similar, and this is echoed by our presentations with Laurie. I think we face the same problem of openness. We face the same problem of getting a fair trade agreements, promoting the rights of people first, and we face the same challenge of actually getting an ambitious agreement that is up to the challenge that we have in front of us in the context of crisis. So I'll stop here because I think I'm already over time, but I'm happy to answer further questions if needs be.
And Celeste Drake, AFL-CIO.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. And again, thanks to the Sierra Club for hosting. And thanks for the people who have taken the time to log on online. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so it's just going to be me talking. And I want to start with my email address and my Twitter account. And I invite anyone to follow up with questions to email me or to follow me on Twitter. And my email is cdrake, that's C-D-R-A-K-E, @AFL-CIO.org. And my Twitter handle is just @cdrakefairtrade. I'm going to start off by saying I'm slightly more optimistic than the prior two speakers, and there's several reasons for that. But I'll start with reading the opening paragraph to our official comments on the TTIP or the TAFTA, or I've heard it called the EURAFTA, whatever you want to call it. The AFL-CIO believes that increasing trade between the United States and the European Union could have positive impacts on both job creation and income growth for America's workers, but it is unlikely to have such impacts unless the United States Trade Representative fundamentally alters its approach to trade agreement negotiations to focus on the creation of good, family-supportive jobs and broadly shared prosperity, instead of simply reducing behind-the-border barriers for the primary benefit of business interests that fail to share increasing profits with the workers whose efforts make those profits. It's kind of a mouthful, and there's a lot of caveats. But so again, why am I slightly more optimistic? Well, because not one word of the trade agreement has been written yet. Not one word. They just started negotiations yesterday, and this week is really a framework week. They're not actually laying out text and starting to work with text yet. And so that means we can change things. We can turn things around and we can win. And here in the United States, those who have worked on fair trade issues for a long time, particularly those in the labor movement, but also the consumer movement, the family farm movement, all these other allied folks, the environmental movement, we sometimes forget that we have won trade fights before, that we stopped the multilateral agreement on investment, that we stopped the free trade agreement of the Americas, and we have an opportunity to do so again. You know, sort of aligned on one side are the potential black hat forces, the U.S. Chamber and its U.S. business allies, their European counterparts, and of course the negotiators on both sides who tend to just sort of blindly do what they've already done before, and you've heard all of what they've done before, and it's pretty awful. On the other side, the potential white hat allies, well, all of us on the fair trade side in the U.S., all those on the fair trade side in the EU, and a lot of the individual EU governments who are a lot more progressive than the U.S. government or some others. And we sometimes forget, I mean, there are countries in Europe where the union density rate is up to 60-65%. Not all of them, but that's a great place to start. What that means is that the civil society there has a lot more influence than sometimes we feel like we have here. So we need to know that we have strong allies and there are governments there that will listen to them in a way that sometimes we don't feel listened to. And we need to utilize those partnerships and activate them and feel that we have some ability to win, because I think we do here. And I think when thinking about this agreement, let's think about some critical questions. Who benefits? Who writes the rules? How are we going to ensure that any benefits that are created are actually shared with families? And a critical question, does the economy that we're creating work for the people? Or are the people just working to perpetuate the economy? And if we ask those questions, we'll figure out why we have to change the way things are. What workers in America have experienced over our past years of free trade agreements has been wage suppression. Wages are now about the same that they were in 1979 for the average worker. You know, the average salary for a U.S. male worker in the United States is currently $36,000 and something annually. If the wage for U.S. workers had continued on the trajectory that it was when it broke off in about 1978-79, it would be over $65,000 a year. So close to double if we hadn't started implementing these so-called neoliberal economic policies, one of which is these trade agreements. American workers have also experienced lost factories. They've gone offshore, lost jobs, loss of union density, a whole host of negative things. Soaring corporate profits. They're at record highs since 1952, where workers' share of income of the national economy is at the lowest point since the 1940s, when we were still coming out of the Great Depression. So these are things that we have to change. A lot of folks think the AFL-CIO is really only concerned about the labor chapter in these agreements. That's not true. We submitted comments to the federal government, 24 pages of them, complete with charts and graphs. We are concerned about jobs, wages, food safety, consumer product safety, investor-state dispute settlement, public services, financial services rules, you name it, we're interested in it because it all affects not just our members, but all workers in America and working families and how they live. So one of the things that's particularly important that has been mentioned before is this investor-state dispute settlement regime. It puts private interests on a parallel with public interests so that the interests of one company, and just one kind of company, a foreign company, that all of our U.S. domestic companies won't have access to these rules to challenge U.S. laws. At stake was some democratically enacted law, regulation, rule, judicial decision, administrative administrative decision, and these 3 commercial arbitrators get to make a determination. And it's really a problem, and particularly think about labor rights. In Egypt, one of the challenges has challenged an increase in the minimum wage. In New Zealand, to just kind of make the story simple, when Sir Peter Jackson went back to make The Hobbit, after he made all of the Lord of the Rings trilogies, he threatened to sue unless he got the same rights he did the first time around, where all the workers were just declared independent contractors, and so they couldn't exercise any worker rights. That's a problem. That's how these are being used to keep our wages down, to keep us from having a voice at work. We're also concerned about the labor chapter. You'd think the EU, it's so progressive, it's so liberal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, would have the, be the perfect partner here. Well, the EU tends to negotiate non-enforceable labor commitments in its trade agreements. At least USTR has been on a trajectory of making somewhat enforceable labor agreement. Now, we have complaints about the U.S. labor chapter. It's not strong enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is one place where the U.S. is going to have to push the EU. And remember that all of the EU is not a labor paradise. Poland has been under a very conservative regime and degrading labor rights over the years. Romania has never kind of come up to snuff with the rest of Western Europe. And if you look at the countries that have been forced to implement austerity measures, Greece, Spain, et cetera, they're having very serious problems. So it is important that we have good enforceable labor commitments. And finally, I just want to mention Buy America. The U.S. is already a member of the WTO's government procurement agreement. That means we've already committed some of our government procurement at the federal and state levels to open up to foreign bidders, including bidders in Europe. So we already have that. Do we need an additional commitment to further open up government procurement to European companies? We have asked USTR time and time again, where are your numbers? How do you show that we actually are creating more jobs in the U.S. through these government procurement commitments than we're losing? They won't show us any numbers. So we think, well, they're just doing it because it's the free trade ideology. They're not doing it because they can show it's really good for American workers. So these are some critical things. It's also public services, as I said, financial services, a lot of things, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we have time for, I'm looking for Alana, maybe 3 questions. Okay. Again, for those at home, you can send questions to tafta@citizenstrade.org. And perhaps we'll start with a question from the web. So this question is actually for Natasha. Are the NSA spying revelations really going to affect the title negotiations, or is it mostly political bluster at this point? Natasha, can you hear us and respond?
Yes. Shall I answer right away, or do you want to take all the questions at once?
No, you go ahead and answer.
Okay. Well, I think actually the political reactions that came after those revelations were very interesting. What we saw, especially in the European Parliament, were some members who are normally keen advocates of this free trade agreement, criticizing very strongly what happened and asking for clarifications before the negotiations could go ahead. So I think what it clearly shows is that people woke up a little bit, and there is a potential that political opposition rises as the negotiation go ahead. While before those revelations, it seemed like from the European Commission and from a vast majority of the European Parliament, this was in a way a done deal, and we would just go ahead with it, and there was no questioning possible on the process itself. What was really interesting from what came out last week is that actually people started asking questions about the process and how these negotiations were being led. So we'll have to see what comes out of this. So the European Parliament, for your information, is actually setting up an inquiry committee on those spying revelations. And I think it's very important for you also to remember that at the end of the negotiations, our European Parliament will have to vote on this deal. So this is where these NSA revelations are very interesting, is that actually if more suspicions come out, if actually the distrust is not, distrust attempts are not tackled, we might well see a much bigger majority in the European Parliament opposing the agreement in the last stage. And I think this is still a very important factor to keep in mind for what's coming up.
Great, thank you. And then we'll do this a little bit press conference style, because to be heard on the mic, we need to be at, or on the camera, we need to be at the mic. But you can take a couple more questions. Are there any from the room? Okay, we have one more from online. This person asks, what is with the Obama administration not wanting a financial services chapter? It has already bound the U.S. to financial service obligations and will presumably do so in the TPP. Lori, you want to take that?
So what the administration has said, as best anyone can understand, is they do not want something the European Union is pushing for, which is a specific new set of disciplines on financial sector regulation and or harmonization to one standard for the US and the EU, i.e. re-litigating the whole fight on regulation. Both of those, both the EU and the US are involved in a lot of multilateral attempts to come up with global standards in the G20, etc. And so it's, I would say, fairly worrisome that the EU is thinking a bilateral approach is the way to go. Pretty transparent, given what they've listed, is a way to roll back the stronger US regulations. So the good news is the Obama administration has said, no, we're not interested in doing that. And there have been a variety of very strong voices, Congressman Waters, Senator Warren, others saying, good, they shouldn't do that. The problem is that, in fact, the US is not saying no financial services chapter. They want a financial services chapter. They just don't want this extra set of regulatory limits. But they do seem, best we can find out, willing to have what are called market access commitments in financial services. And the market access commitments, though it sounds benign, actually conflate together liberalization and deregulation. So the limits and regulation that the US seems willing to accept are 5 different kinds of non-discriminatory regulations that simply won't be allowed. And this includes bans on dangerous financial services and products, rules relating to the size. Can you limit the size of a firm? Can you put up firewalls between different kinds of services? Can you require a specific legal form? If those kind of rules are in place, the consumer groups are urging the US to take major exceptions to make sure that we can preserve our existing regulations and have space to increase them. Because although the US has given up a lot of that space already in the WTO, there still is space left, number one. And number two, this agreement under the current plan would be privately enforceable by all the financial service firms. So even if the US and the EU have made crazy limits on deregulation commitments in the global WTO, who's going to throw the brick in the glass house? They're both susceptible. But if it's one private financial firm that wants to use those rules to get rid of some law, that's very, very dangerous. So to distinguish, they're saying the right thing about one set of regulatory limits, they're saying the wrong thing about another set, and it's something that a lot of the consumer groups are very worried about.
Thanks. Other questions or thoughts from the audience for discussion? Sure, go ahead.
I'm sorry, what was your name? Celeste. How do you respond to people who say, with respect to wages not rising, that non-salary benefits have gone up? How do you respond?
Can you join at the podium?
that's actually a double-edged sword. For some workers, the employer will continue to add to, say, healthcare benefits because the cost of healthcare benefits keep rising, and sometimes that's in lieu of a salary increase. But for other workers, that's offset by the employer simply dropping the healthcare benefits, or the employer oftentimes simply dropping pension benefits. So it's not, that is often sort of one excuse, well, this just covers it. But it's also quite similar as there's another excuse, well, it's simply the non-college educated workers who are having a problem with their annual salary. It's really not the college educated workers. And that's not the case either. What's really true in the end is that the gains are really going to the top 1% to bring back the model that the Occupy movement brought forth. All of the gains that have been achieved since the financial crisis of 2008 have gone to the top 1%. So while there have been some gains below there, the losses for the rest of the 99% have equaled out. And really, those who benefit are those at the very, very top. And again, it's not solely the trade policy that we can say is the sole driving factor of wage suppression, but it's one of the major factors, and it's because capital is global and it can freely move, and workers are not necessarily. And what global capital is doing is playing this international arbitrage where it's putting countries in competition with each other for who can pay the lowest wages, who can provide the lowest level of worker protections, who can provide the lowest benefits, the worst safety, the weakest environmental regulations, et cetera, et cetera. So while another country may gain jobs at the expense of U.S. workers because they'll offer sort of to go down on this level, the workers there are also potentially worse off, because now they've got worse jobs with worse benefits, and they've lost bargaining power as well, because now they have to protect what they've got for the next country that's going to go lower and lower and lower.
Great. I think that takes up our time for this panel on what's at stake, and we'll invite the second panel up to get started now. I'll just note one thing. As we ask questions here in the audience in DC, speak loudly, and perhaps even the answerer should repeat the question into the microphone so those at home can hear it. Thanks so much.